It's another day, and it is another day for a crash course. This time, we're going to be talking about CSS. A little bit easier to write this time, it's got to be said, because CSS has a lot more to talk about, I would think, than HTML. And I don't want to be dismissive of HTML. I made that point very, very clear in the HTML crash course, so I will not reiterate too much in that direction because CSS and HTML work together quite a bit. And we'll actually be talking about some HTML stuff in this episode, such as certain attributes you set and other things like that. So this is the CSS crash course for absolute beginners. And again, this is an audio version of the crash course. I eventually down the road hopefully plan on doing a YouTube video of this. So if you're like, hey, this isn't, syntax heavy and things like that, I tried to accommodate an audio show with this crash course. So, I mean, if you like it, let us know. If you don't like it, let us know and let us know why, so that if I do something like this in the future, I know what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, and all the rest of that good stuff. So, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app. Join us in our Discord server or share this with your friends. And if you want to help out not only yourself, but us as well, you can net yourself up to 20% off a Scrimba Pro plan. And you can find that link in the show description and in the show notes. Full details in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. And remember that we are powered by Code Rabbit. They give you the power of AI code reviews to help cut your code review time in half. Check out the link in the show notes and episode description to net yourself a 14-day free trial, no credit card needed, and just a 2-click sign up with a GitHub or GitLab account. So, I just want to reiterate, this is for absolute beginners. There's no overwhelming syntax dumps, just concepts that you can kind of imagine and understand and then maybe start Googling from through this audio program. A little fancy. Anyway, so I want to just re-break something down. So I like to have visualizations, I like to have examples, I like to, go through things like that. And I want you to kind of think of a website like a person. And we've already kind of covered this a little bit in the HTML crash course episode, which is, the HTML is largely the skeleton. It is the bones, if you will, that give the website structure. So what is the CSS then? And I'm breaking this skeleton down effectively into, or this person, I guess, down into 3 different parts: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we're on that second part right now. CSS, what is it? It is the appearance. It's the thing you actually see on a person. You're not looking at their bones. You're not looking at their, their pelvis or their toe bones or whatever you're looking at. You're looking at their flesh, their hair, their eyes, their clothing. And again, it's the appearance. And that's what you're doing here. If you were to go and just write up some HTML, which you may have done after listening to our HTML crash course for absolute beginners, you may, likely noticed that whatever you produced in the browser is very, very simple. It's very largely text-based for the most part. It's very structural. Even your H1 through H6, there's different font sizes, but you didn't select those font sizes. You didn't select a lot of the spacing, if any of the spacing that you did with stuff. And more or less, you chose what's going to appear and in what order. You chose those bones, and that's generally what you did and what order they appear in. So now with the CSS, you're going to be able to add those things, again, the flesh, the hair, the eyes, the clothing. You're going to be able to add, if we were to, kind of draw a compare and contrast, you're going to be able to add text colors. You're going to be able to add spacing, layout things, all different kinds of things like that. You're going to make the website look like a website. So what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And as I said, it controls how HTML looks. And it does this through things like colors, fonts, spacing, layouts, all kinds of things. Without CSS, the website looks just like plain text and blocks. With CSS, it becomes polished, styled, and visually engaging. You can also do some things like some animations and some movement and things like that. But if we go back to our analogy of think of a website like a person, JavaScript, which is the third and sort of final basic pillar of a website, JavaScript is sort of the brain. It allows for interactivity and thought, such as, like this, like if I click this button, this other thing will come flying in. It allows you for that interactivity. Now, CSS is able to do a little bit of this as it's matured over the years. And we have previous episodes where we have mentioned that, actually, where we've talked about how some of the JavaScript features have been taken over by CSS. I just want to be clear right now that that's well beyond the scope of this CSS crash course, but I just didn't want to confuse anybody if you've listened to that prior episode and you're like, hey, Matt, you said that, some of that interactivity and things have been taken over by CSS. That's true, but that's not the prime function. that's not the main reason why CSS exists. It exists just to make the website look good for the most part.
I think before we dive too far into CSS, I do want to kind of lay out my thoughts on it a little bit, and like I want to point out how much of a jump it is from HTML. So HTML isn't simple. Like we talked about that in the HTML episode, where there is some complexity there, right? Like there's some things that are simple. There's some things that can get pretty complex. There's some rabbit holes you can go down, but overall, it's pretty structured. There's certain ways to do things. With CSS, this kind of goes out the window where to style a website properly, you can go down some crazy rabbit holes and it becomes and can become fairly complex. If anyone's already done a lot of CSS, you already know, but this is a pain point that a lot of people have with development in general, especially web development, where they are stuck writing CSS for, hours and hours and hours. They want to get to code. Some people like CSS, so some people specialize in it, right? Some people really, really specialize in writing some really good CSS and creating some really intricate websites. So you can do a ton of very specialized design with CSS. And because of that, because of the flexibility that it allows, it is a fairly complex system, right? If we look at a comparable in like XML layouts on Android or something like that, or the Swift layout system on Apple, those are a lot more structured. Those have a lot better pattern matching systems where you have certain ways to do certain things and that's it, right? So not to say that it's easy, but compared to CSS and compared to the almost infinite complexity that it can bring, designing for a phone and laying out on a phone and strictly on a phone is a lot simpler than creating a very complex system that's supposed to run on any device. And we'll talk about responsivity later. I think Matt has this whole section on it. But I just want to set the stage for this because Matt will give you a really good high level overview of CSS, but this isn't one of those like, oh, I understand, I can move on. If you want to learn CSS, this is a thing that you're going to have to practice for a long time and then still probably continue practicing throughout your entire career. Yeah, that's I just wanted to set the stage. I just wanted to make sure that everyone is understanding that this is a pretty significant jump from HTML.
Well, the thing too is I feel like this might be a commonality throughout the majority of these crash courses if we do the three, because I mean we talked about how HTML, is something to not be sort of tossed aside and just, it's easy, I'll just learn it later, or I'll just learn it very basic and it doesn't matter. I mean, CSS, it is more complex, but a lot of people will also toss CSS aside largely. And like there are people out there that are very, very talented with CSS, and they're doing things that even I don't understand fully. And I've been using CSS for a number of years. I'd say I'm, an advanced CSS user, I'd say myself, because I can read most people's CSS. I understand what's going on and all the rest of it. But they're like CSS is really complex. And that also does kind of echo the thing that I was saying, where, JavaScript is largely the brain of the website. Again, in the three pillars, it's basically the brain of the website. It can, send data, it can grab data from other sites and things, and it can do all these kind of fancy things. But CSS is no slouch. CSS is not just setting, the font size to be a certain color or whatever. CSS can detect if you're hovering over things and then change the color or make it like spin in a circle. CSS can make things 3D and make things rotate, and CSS can animate things, and it can do all these sorts of things. And, I'm going to say like 90%, including even in my job, 90%, if not more, of the CSS that you're going to do, even professionally, is not going to be all that advanced. A lot of it's going to be layouts and making things work because, websites are largely flat, but we've all seen websites where they have a fancy animation or a fancy way to lay things out. And sometimes that is advanced CSS alone. And sometimes that is CSS plus a little bit of JavaScript as well. And so I'm not, again, this episode is not going to be JavaScript heavy by any means, but Mike is 100% correct in saying that, CSS is absolutely no slouch. I am going through the very basics here in the crash course. There is a lot more to learn. And there are several times in this episode where I say, hey, I give you an example of two or three things. There's actually way more than these two or three, but these are the ones that I use every day. And there are more out there that people are going to use and people can in fact use. So I want to tackle the very first question, and that is, and this is something that I always get mad about actually when I go to build something. where does the CSS go? Now, I don't necessarily get mad about specifically where CSS goes. I always talk to Mike about this is like whenever I work with any sort of technology or framework, I get bogged down because I'm like, okay, great. I understand this code snippet or I understand what the goal of this product is or this plugin is. Where do I go to set all this stuff? Where do I actually put this code snippet? Where does it go? And so, to answer the question about CSS, CSS can be placed inside of its own files with the CSS extension, and these are referred to as style sheets. It can alternatively be nested inside of a style element in your HTML, or another alternative, it can actually be placed inside a style attribute on your HTML element. This is also referred to as inline styles in some cases. Or I guess that is literally what it's called, but just to let you know, not in some cases. That's just what it's called. So, how does CSS work? So, at a very high level, CSS selects HTML elements and then styles them accordingly with spacing, layout, colors, positioning, and much more. And in general, CSS selects HTML elements by their tag name. So, for example, you're going to select all the P tags or all the paragraph tags. It can select HTML elements by their class name or their ID, which we'll get deep into in this episode. And you can also select HTML elements via a combination of these three of your choosing. Now, this is one of these little disclaimers is that there are other ways to select elements, but they go beyond this basic introduction. You can select things by, hey, I want all the first children of all paragraphs or all paragraphs with this ID and this class and things. You can get really, really creative with this, but that is a more rare thing to do in CSS. And again, is beyond the idea of a crash course. So if you see like a really advanced selector and you're a beginner, you might be looking at some material that's a bit too difficult for yourself because you're going to start getting buried in like, hang on, like they're selecting an ID and there's a class in here, but there's also a P tag, and you're going to get a little bit too bogged down. In my learnings when I was learning it, I learned all this stuff kind of one by one. And so I would like select all the paragraphs and I would go, okay, I can select via paragraphs. But then I would say, okay, I want, maybe the first paragraph to be red and all the other ones to be blue. Well, how would I do that? Okay, well, I need some sort of other identifier, another way to select it. And I wouldn't go right to the most complicated, pseudo classes and pseudo elements and things, which are again beyond the scope of this. But I would go and be like, okay, maybe I'll add a class name to it or something like that. And don't worry, if you don't know what class names are, if you don't know what IDs are, we're going to cover it in a little bit here. Now, in general, CSS styles elements by setting properties to specific values. So basically, you're saying, okay, I want to select all the p tags, all the paragraphs, and then you set the properties of that element that you selected. So in this case, all the paragraphs. And you might change the property. One of the properties, excuse me, that you can set is called color. So you can set, the color of all the paragraphs to red. You may select what's called the display property. That's a very common one. And you may actually want to hide that paragraph or all the paragraphs. And so you would set the display property to the value of none, for example. And there's a bunch of other popular ones like grid, block, and flex that the display property can be set to. And I want to mention that specifically because these properties have specific rules that they need to be set to. You can't just like literally write the paragraph like color, I want this to be red or something. There's rules that are put in place. So for example, like color, you might want to choose like the hex code for red, or in some cases you can use some keywords such as literally the word red. Spacing is another really big thing in HTML, or excuse me, in CSS. And the margin property is something that you may also set to add a little bit of distance between your other elements on the page and the paragraphs that you're selecting. And the margin can be set to numeric values in various units, such as pixels is really common, but there's other units of measurement as well that you can use. And margin, sets the spacing between the element that you selected, so the paragraphs, and the things around it. And you can do this property in a variety of different ways. It can have two numbers, which represents the top and bottom, and then the left and right. You can do four numbers for each of the sides, top, right, bottom, and left. Or you can also do just one number and it sets all of them. The top, down, the bottom, right, doesn't matter. Left and right, it just selects the margin for all around your paragraph. Now, CSS as the name suggests, has a cascading effect, meaning that things, quote unquote, roll down the document or cascade down the document. So, for example, if you set the color property of a paragraph to red, and then later on you select paragraphs again and you set the color to blue, on the actual website, it's not going to show red, it's actually going to show blue. Now, I do want to say here that this is again one of those disclaimers, and that is that there is some nuance here. And I'm going to explain this nuance right now, and it's called specificity or CSS specificity. Now, specificity can get really, really complicated, and I'm just going to break it down at a beginner level because there's actually specificity score, and you can find videos online of people calculating exactly what they're selecting based on a specificity score and things like that. I want to be clear, I never do that on the job, and I naturally learned specificity for my own purposes, and I do use some fairly advanced CSS at times. So if you look at some of these videos and you're like, "Oh my god, I have to memorize all these specificity numbers." I don't think that that's the case. I'm gonna about 90 to 99% in my experience, you'll just learn naturally throughout the job. So what is this thing that you're gonna learn naturally throughout the job? So in CSS, specificity is like a scoring system that decides which style wins if there's a conflict. So I just mentioned the paragraphs, for example, and you make the paragraph red, and then further down the document to make the paragraph blue. That's really easy, right? Cascades down. The document's like set it to red, nope, set it to blue, and then that's what the user gets. They get blue paragraphs. Well, this specificity thing adds a bit of nuance. And so there's three sort of categories here that I've added. There's lowest specificity. So these are styles applied within tags, within element tags like paragraphs or H1s or divs and things. These are the weakest and can easily be overridden. Let's think about something really quick. And in the beginning of this, I mentioned that you do your CSS in style sheets. That's oftentimes the most common place you'll do them. You can also do it within style tags, but you can also do it via the inline styles via that style attribute. This is a lot of the nuance, not all of it, but this is a lot of the nuance as to where things mess up. Because if you think about it, I'm saying, hey, it's cascading down the style sheet. Yeah, but what happens when some of the styles are set in the HTML and some of the styles are set in the style sheets? And so specificity is how it determines what to actually set the color to or other properties as well. So we did the lowest specificity. What's the medium specificity? Well, medium specificity, there are classes, there are attributes and pseudo classes like button. You can select things via like type text and things or cover or like hover when you're hovering over something. These carry more weight than plain elements. So, for example, if I were to set the hover style of my paragraphs first, right? And let's just say I set that to purple. And then down further below the document, I say I want all my paragraphs to be red. Whenever I hover, even though that red is being set later, hover has a higher specificity because I'm hovering over. So whenever my mouse is over top of that paragraph, it will become purple, as an example. Now, the hover and the type text and that, those are a little bit more of advanced CSS, so we're not going to talk about those again today. But classes are absolutely going to be something that I've already mentioned, I think, earlier, and we're going to get into in a little bit here as well. And then the third and last one here, you have your highest specificity. So things like IDs, which we're going to get into shortly, and inline styles. So that's that style attribute in your HTML. So an ID beats classes and tags and inline styles, and inline styles beat almost everything unless you use a special part of your property or special section of the value of your property, which is you add what's called the important status to it. So we're not going to worry about all that. I think I don't think it like translates too well to audio to like constantly talk about specificity. I said, like, there's people that do specificity scores and things. And even though I try to simplify it down into 3 points, it's might sound a little bit like gobbledygook. So we're going to move on to what classes and IDs are, Mike, unless you had any comments to add there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, we can't really go too far into specificity, but something that I didn't do when I was first starting out CSS is learn about specificity enough. And because of that, I was writing really janky CSS code where I would put a bunch of importance everywhere, and I would, I would have like some tags in IDs, some tags with classes, and I would kind of style both simultaneously sometimes and couldn't figure out why something was broken. So I think learning about specificity on your own right now, like, is a good idea if you're just getting into CSS. Like, go about, try to break it, try to figure out what works, what doesn't. How does import order affects things? How does, where to put your styles, having multiple style sheets. Like, there's a lot of complexity that can be had in here. And I chose to just go about and kind of go into styling without learning it, and it bit me in the ass several times, even in production sometimes, because how servers handle specificity, like depending on the machine that you're coding on versus the machine that it's loaded on, depending on where it's loaded, like how the order of the files is loaded in. Again, top of the file to bottom of the file matters. And therefore, if you import a bunch of files, how they're imported also matters. I've had that show up where, like, on my local machine, everything was fine. In production, something was wrong. Learning about it would have made a ton more sense at the time, and I didn't, so just recommend you going a little bit deeper here.
Yeah, I like it. I think honestly, specificity is something that I learned absolutely like what you said, Mike, where you kind of like go in and you kind of like break it, mess around with it. And like, I mean, I'll just mention that highest specificity sort of point again, like an ID beats classes and tags. Like go in and like mess with that and like set all the paragraphs in your style sheet, right? To red, and then go and set via ID everything to like blue, and then also go in and set an inline style as well. And you can see what takes priority. And then also add the important, I guess I'll call it a flag. I just did a quick Google because I'm not even actually sure what it was effectively called. And in CSS, what you can do is you can add, so you can set your property like normal, but then you can add an exclamation mark important. And it's actually referred to as an important flag or important decision. I always just say in my kind of daily that I'm setting it to important, but that's the formal definition there. But basically it's like you're just trying to see like what the CSS is actually going to render on the screen for the user at the end of the day once everything's read in. The style sheets, the inline styles, how things are ordered, a whole bunch of different things like that. So I think we'll move on to classes and IDs now. Classes and IDs are very, very common ways to select HTML elements, and they are set via HTML attributes, which are named appropriately class and ID. Elements can have multiple classes, but only one ID. Classes can be used on several elements, so the same class. However, IDs must be unique and only used once. I'm going to say something important here, and that is that if you accidentally use an ID in multiple locations, the CSS will only apply to the first instance, and that is actually invalid. Like that is actually an error in your HTML that you should not have two elements with the same ID. Nothing's going to crash. Nothing's going to break other than maybe the wrong element is going to get styled if you are styling by selecting by that ID. But that is something to keep an eye out because you might be like, hey, like nothing's crashing. Like my website must be working, but there can be some invalid HTML in there like that.
So one thing, another thing to point out on this part is how loosey goosey web development is in this way. So if you're used to strongly typed languages, if you're used to compiler based languages, you're going to notice a lot in HTML where it's like, this just how it is, and if it doesn't work in production, it doesn't work. That's not the way that, like, a lot of these other languages go about, because usually what should happen in that case is it should detect that you're using the same ID because it's in the IDE, and give you a warning or an error or something like that, and not even let you, push it to production or whatever. And initially, when you're first getting into web development, if you're not using any tools around getting those warnings like linters and IDEs that support that, you're gonna notice a lot of these, like, things that get to production or get to your dev environment and aren't clearly labeled as a mistake. And that's very typical in web development. That's typical in HTML, that's typical in CSS, and that's even more typical in JavaScript. Because again, JavaScript is a script language, which means it runs at runtime without any compiler checking if anything goes wrong. So this is something to get used to. If you're coming from a more strict language system, this is where people get kind of mad at JavaScript and mad at web development, because they can see a lot of really big issues being put into production or, into your testing environments even without any sort of feedback to you. One thing I do want to say is that the development environment, as you get deeper into it, has started to accommodate for this with something like TypeScript. I'm not going to get too far into it. I'm just going to tell you that there are tools available that help with this specific problem where when you do something that's not like particularly breaking, but not in scope or not right and could have intricate effects down the line that aren't easily testable, it will give you that error right in your IDE. There are things that can do that, so don't get too bogged down in that. Just try to learn the rules, quote unquote, and stick to them as much as you can. And when you get to a place where you're actually coding in production, you'll probably have something that helps you with it.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'll just dive in now, I think, to like what, because like we talked about kind of like the theory of what like classes and IDs are, but like, what are they? Like you're probably like, well, what are these things? Like are these specific numbers? Are these specific letters? What are these things? And you can generally set, or rather you generally set classes and IDs to identifiable names. You actually choose those names. You write those names in yourself. And you want to write things that are, going to be kind of familiar to you, like content box or like main paragraph or something like that. But there's going to be exceptions to that rule. So for programmatic and organizational reasons, especially in large design systems, sometimes you just can't write everything as an identifiable name because either the system won't understand or the design system is so complex that you've kind of used all the identifiable names. And so you start kind of having some gobbledygook. And so here's the sort of official rules on what you can actually put inside of these things. So, like I said before, they're actually attributes. And so the ID attribute, HTML attribute, it can start, or rather, it has to start with a letter. So A through Z, that could be a capital or lowercase, doesn't matter. And after it starts with a letter, there's a variety of allowed characters. So it can include letters, it can include digits 0 through 9, it can include hyphens, it can also include underscores, colons, and periods. Again, after the first character. Number one thing here, though, is that there's a small note. Colons and periods are generally discouraged because there's some popular tooling out there, jQuery and other things, where this might start to mess with the compatibility. And so if you start adding things like jQuery and other tooling to your project down the road as your project gets more complex, you might start having some compatibility issues. I just stay away from colons and periods and IDs. I just don't bother with it, but it's technically allowed. Once again, just to reiterate, an ID value must be unique within the entire HTML document, and you may not use any spaces. You cannot use any spaces. Class names are very similar, but there are some differences. So class names, starting character must start with a letter or an underscore or a hyphen. So that's a difference there. The allowed characters can be letters, numbers, hyphens, and underscores, and you cannot do any spaces on these either.
I've always
Now,
wondered
mhm.
why the limitation is starting with a letter. Have you ever like I've seen that in a few different places. Like there's some database situations where you can't like do a number at first too. I think at some point Twitter, I don't know if it still is, you can't have a username that starts with a number or something like that. Like there's a bunch of places where that's the case. I wonder if it's something to do with how processing of data happens or something like that. Like I've always wondered that.
I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I've always sort of just roughly equated it to, how like in Windows certain characters are out of bounds for when you want to set a file name
Mhm.
or when you want to set a folder name. I've always kind of equated it to that where it's like the system is like, whoa, we need that for something, right? And so like I kind of wonder whether it would mess up with that unless it was exited in somehow in some case in which you can't do inside of this. So it's like, hey, sorry man, you can't have that because like we have that under the system. Like whether it's like tabulating all the attributes under like, dot name, dot this, dot. I don't know if that's true. But then if you had like dot dot, the system would be like, what? What's this mean? Right. And then you start having some conflicts. That's an estimate. I'm sure the answer is out there, but I don't have it. And actually, this is actually a good little discussion here, is because there's things that I've been in HTML and doing CSS and making websites for a long time. So is Mike, and there's things that we don't know. And so if you're listening to this, you're an absolute beginner, and you're like, my God, there's so much to know. Like I don't know all this stuff. Like I just googled that important flag, right? Because I just call it making the property important. I didn't really even think of like having a formal name for it until I googled it there. And so there's things that you're just going to kind of do naturally as you do the job, where you're going to understand these things and know it. But then if you were to go for like a formal test or something like that, like even me, it's like I would have to study up on some stuff because like I can't, I can't remember all these specific things. And there's some things that just you'd never come up on the job. It's just sort of like, hey, don't use periods there, okay? And then that's it. Like that's it, right? Like you don't think of it again. And that's one of them right there. Now, this is something that I actually got confused about when I was learning. It's rather simple, but it was confusing because the guides I looked up, this is a number of years ago now, really didn't have the greatest language to explain this. I hope that I do a better job. And that is, why do we prefer classes over IDs? So, generally speaking, classes are preferred over IDs. And this is because classes are reusable and consistent. What does that mean? You're probably like, well, okay, great, Matt. Thanks for like the keyword. Well, what does it mean? You can use classes on several elements, and you use them for elements that have like styles. So, for example, the content boxes on your website might all have the same style, right? The same border and background color and spacing around them and things like that. So they might literally have the class content dash box, for example. If you need a variation, so let's just say, a red content box instead of a blue one, you can just actually add another class to the same element without breaking your existing code. So, for example, maybe your content box, you're setting your font size, your spacing through margin or padding or whatever, and then your color. So, it's just three elements, three properties there, right? Three properties to set. But you need to change that color. Well, instead of you having, content box 2, you might have another class called like content box featured or maybe just even featured. And you put those two classes together and then through the cascading effect, you have the content box class setting your spacing and setting your fonts, right? But then it keeps reading down and it's like, "Oh, this is a featured one," and it changes the color from that original color that was set in content box. So that's a bit of a tutorial. It's a bit more advanced and something you're definitely, not going to do if you're brand new to CSS right away. Like I didn't start combining classes until maybe like, I don't know, a couple weeks in or something because I wasn't in school or something. So it wasn't like I was doing hard units and like, some sort of a specified pathway through a textbook or something. But it took me a couple weeks and then I started like combining classes to get some cool effects and things. So classes, they're reusable, they're consistent, and that's why. IDs, you can still select like so your CSS selects the ID. You can still set all the properties you want, like just like normal, right? The problem is that IDs can create specificity problems when overwriting styles. So some people will use them kind of excessively. And not only are you kind of filling up your HTML for no real reason, you yourself have to manage making sure they're all unique because again, there's no error catch there. So, you are the brain there and you're managing this. If you have a very complex project, like with a lot of HTML, a lot of IDs, a lot of classes everywhere, that's going to become really painful to like make sure that your IDs are all unique and proper. And then also you're going to go back because someone's going to request a style change naturally over time and you're going to try to set the color again and you're going to be like, why is this color not setting to what I want? And it's because there's like a specificity issue because you have an ID and then you also have something in your style sheet and you're selecting something in a different order and things. And so you just want to make life easier for yourself. So it's not that IDs are creating necessarily a technical issue. They just can potentially cause specificity issues in sort of our own, I guess, human organization and can just cause a bit of issues there. And this is, of course, due to the specificity score, which we already mentioned before. We're not going to get back into that because it's jumping into the weeds. And just in general, you'll hear this one, said quite a bit. Classes keep your CSS flexible and maintainable. What does that mean? Well, I mentioned that your CSS style sheets, your HTML, if the site keeps growing, you start getting lots of pages, maybe even multiple style sheets, things start getting complex. Even though it's HTML and CSS, things start getting complex. And if you have classes that are like content box, you go to make a new page and you need 6 content boxes. You just put 6 content box elements and set all their class attributes to content box and you're off to the races. And you already have that done. And then if you need to change how content boxes are styled, generally you'll keep them all together when applicable in the CSS style sheet. So you control F, find your content dash box, class name and go and like adjust it as needed. That's an example of maintainability where you're able to go back when the project especially is not fresh in your mind. Or maybe you're working on a new feature of or new page and you haven't really messed with the content boxes forever, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's Christmas, or it's, enter in holiday here. We want the color of that holiday to be the background color. Red, green, white, yellow, doesn't matter. Right? Well, I want the Halloween, I want it to be orange. Now you can just go back and just do a quick little change to your one class, and boom, now everything's orange for Halloween. Now everything's red for Christmas, whatever. And I want to mention something else here as well. And as you go through guides, CSS has been updated. So we mentioned in the HTML crash course that, there was HTML4. Now there's HTML5. So there's been versions. JavaScript has similar versions. They're called ES. So there's like ES5, ES6, things like that. CSS does grow through time. And so, early CSS handled, simple colors and text. CSS3, which is what we're using now, introduced animations, transitions, flexible layouts for things like responsivity and things, which is something we'll touch on shortly. And then within there's been iterations. So modern CSS is starting to do things like container queries and subgrid. And these are things that I'm just going to touch on because it's too advanced for this crash course. But nesting, which is something I just started doing a lot, vanilla or native nesting rather than using like a SAS and all that. Scroll linked animations, all kinds of things. These are things that are being added to CSS. And so the reason why I mention this is that you don't need to be updating your knowledge every day or even every month, but you might be flipping through a guide and you might be like, hey, why does this guy do it this way and this guy do it this way? Maybe the new way is more efficient. And it's because CSS does go through iterations. And that's a mistake I've absolutely made, where I've gone to an old guide and haven't realized kind of how old it is. And then just thought that's how I do it. And then all the more modern guides do it this other way. And I'm like, what is going on here? And it's because CSS does have evolutions like anything else. And so there's an old and a new way to do it. Doesn't mean the old way is necessarily invalid, but there may be a reason. So you may want to do a quick Google where you're like, hey, why are we, why did it go from this to this? Maybe there's a good reason, and then you'll adopt the newer way to do it.
I think the really interesting thing about this is how much evolution changes our perspective on things in CSS. So, for example, when we were first starting out, and even like a while after that, there was a really popular meme in our web development space of centering a div or centering text, where like that required actual skill and knowledge and everything like that. And there was the meme was like, oh, developers spend essentially all their time centering divs, and in some cases that was kind of true because it was sometimes complicated. Like you would have to have calculations in there to properly center things on a page. Like I remember using a Calc 50 or a Calc 49 or a Calc 48 even to center it so that it's the exact middle of a div. Whereas now that's not even talked about because of the evolutions in CSS3 of like flexbox and grid, where it's literally just a property on a element on in a client, like in your CSS, where you just put text center, or you put flex item center, or
Justify
or
content center,
justify content center, line
and
item
things.
center.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's it. That'll center anything, text, divs, anything. So it really is important to continue to follow the trends, because you could be doing things very high effort that could be one line of code. It's similar things with animations. Like before animations were put into CSS, they were a huge pain in the ass to do. Like you had to have, several JavaScript libraries, and you still do for some things, but for simple animations, it's a couple lines of CSS code now. So you can do a lot with CSS if you follow the standards, if you look at all the new features that have been added. CSS has really evolved over time.
Well, that's a prime example of the thing I was trying to get across earlier in the episode as well, is that, JavaScript, or sorry, CSS has taken some of the functionality of JavaScript, but that doesn't break my sort of visualization of like the person of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript being like the skeleton, the visual part of the appearance, and then the brain, is because, CSS is becoming more advanced and is a little brainy, if you will, but it's not the brain, type of thing. So it's like CSS has gotten a little bit more advanced. It's gotten a little bit more autonomy for itself, I guess you could say, roughly. But like JavaScript is still the one where it's the one that like makes like a lot of the decisions and calls for data and more and more things that more advanced web pages do. And to kick off this, or sorry, to kick off, but to finish up this episode, I have a list of 8 common beginner CSS mistakes. So these are things that I've seen people make mistakes in forums, guides, just myself over time, things like that. So let's just run down the list as we go. Number one, and this is like really common, and I've already warned you against it, overusing IDs instead of classes. This leads to overly specific selectors and hard to maintain code. And I have an example of this. So we had somebody call us in a panic. They had hired somebody to make them a website. Said person was not a professional. They were actually just an employee there, and they were not developers. And this person knew how to do HTML and CSS, and so they got them to make the website. Well, the website was just HTML and CSS, but everything was an ID. There wasn't a single class in there. And so all the content boxes were like effectively content box 1, content box 2, content box 3, content box 4. And the same styles were used over and over and over and over and over again. So I went in and they still wanted it to be just HTML and CSS. Very simple website, number of years ago. And so I went in and completely redid everything and gave them like a very sort of like design system light, so that in the future I'd be able to go and actually change things. And sure enough, a few months later they had a price change. Price change took me 5 minutes, and I even added a new section to the table because I use my own. I don't even think I even changed any of my CSS because I use my own little design system with classes and IDs only when needed. I do want to mention something here. We've kind of talked down to IDs quite a bit. When are IDs needed? When something actually truthfully needs a unique identifier. Sometimes that is for programmatic reasons with JavaScript, where JavaScript will either set an ID or read an ID or read something else and then set an ID based on some sort of calculation or something. Or in CSS, there might literally be, a single thing that really needs to be styled a certain way. And it absolutely needs to be styled that way. And it's the only one there. Then that can have an ID. Don't be scared of IDs. Just don't overuse IDs. I saw somebody on Stack Overflow, funnily enough, say that one of their teachers said that IDs are like Highlanders. There can be only one. And there's going to be a lot of young people listening to this going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, that's an 80s, 90s show / movie series that I really enjoyed. It's really cheesy, but it's awesome. So go check that out and then learn CSS. Watch all 5 or whatever seasons it is. Yeah, enjoy them. Enjoy that show. Number 2 here. Number 2, common beginner CSS mistakes. Not understanding the cascade. So remember that the C in CSS means cascade. Later styles in the document can override earlier ones. Beginners will often get stuck because they'll say change a color, change a font size, something like that, change a style, whatever it is, and then not realize why it isn't working. And so make sure you go and you check through. Is it set in line? Did someone put an important flag on it? Did somebody mess with it? Did someone like put it only in the style sheet and then someone put it in line? Did someone put a style element in the HTML and it's in there somewhere? Check your specificity, make sure it's not set in multiple places. That's where you would first start looking, and you'll get better and better and better at troubleshooting issues like this. But I'm going to say this, I still get stumped by CSS issues. Usually they're rather advanced. I still get stumped for like an hour where it's like, where the heck is this being set? And a lot of that has to do with modern tooling, I will say, where like something is setting this and that's setting this and this thing's setting this on a backup and this is the fallback for this. And there's all these different catches and all these different things. And so that definitely absolutely happens. 100% happens. However, when you're just writing it sort of like plain Jane, you're just writing HTML and CSS, it can still happen. You get all tangled around, you don't know where things are. Remember the specificity. Remember, it might be in multiple places. And I actually want to mention something that I probably should have mentioned during the episode. That important flag should really not be used that much. It should only be used when it absolutely needs to be used. Don't just be like, I don't understand specificity, I'm just going to use the important flag. Don't do that. Because now you're introducing a similar issue of specificity where with the IDs, where you're adding a complex specificity issue. Don't do that. Like, seriously, don't do that. I use it, for
It's bit it's
example. Well,
it's bit my ass several times, yeah.
yeah, no, but yeah, and it's like, for example, a common use case that I use is when someone needs something fixed immediately. They're using a CMS that allows me to put in a bit of quick CSS. I change the CSS and I can't figure out where this complex CMS with all the theme files and everything else, where it's setting this thing. they need this thing fixed today. I'll do a quick little bit of CSS with an important flag. Now it's fixed. But then I will, like, I'll let the client know, hey, this is, this color's been changed or this font's now visible or whatever it is. And then I will go and try to hunt it down and see if I can't do it properly without needing the important flag. Sometimes I've needed to leave the important flag in, and you can still do that. But like Mike said, it's bit him in the ass. Like what happened to you, Mike? What has it done for you? Like is it, because it is an issue. Like it's something that's good but also bad.
Yeah, I've had several things. So I would put a temporary. I would always say this is a temporary solution, but then I would just leave it in there, and then later on, a month down the line, I'll come back to the project and I'll start styling it again, and all of a sudden, whatever I'm trying to style isn't being kept. And so again, I follow the specificity. I know the specificity, but something is breaking it, and it takes me some time to dive in to realize again that hey, I'm the one that kind of screwed myself over by hot fixing something with an important tag, and then not going back and fixing it. So I try really, really hard to never use important anymore, and I've succeeded for the most part. Like I don't think I've used an important tag at all in the last couple years. I think I've actually been able to skirt it.
I'd say about a year for me even. Like, I mean, it's kind of
Mhm.
weird to like time it out, but like
Yeah.
the last one I remember was a quick little WordPress fix, but it was for a seasonal change. So it's kind of like we just did a change and then got rid of it. So
Mhm.
it was like, I'm not going to do the research to figure out where this color is being set. I'm just going to do the thing for the 2 week event and then just get rid of it. Right. And that's something else with websites as well, is you'll start to learn, is you'll start to realize like, you know what, a quick band-aid here is actually appropriate because it's only for a couple weeks, or because it's for something that's going to be torn up, or a little bit of that project management. You'll slowly, the listener out there, you'll slowly understand and start to like pick up on things like that as well. Number 3 out of 8, inline styles everywhere. Easy at first, but very annoying to maintain, very difficult. External or internal style sheets are better. External style sheets refer to those files with the CSS file extension. Internal are those style tags, as I mentioned, because you can put a bunch of CSS nested within a set, a style element. That's called an internal style sheet. The reason why inline styles are difficult is because they're on each element. So it's literally a style attribute equals, and then you type in a bunch of CSS, but you have to do that on each element. Like, because you're like, set this one, set this one, set this one, set this one. And so you can imagine your HTML just ballooning, especially if you have like 4 or 5 properties per element on average. That's going to be a lot. You're not using classes, you're not using IDs. If you use style sheets, whether it be internal or external, my preference is external, all your styles are in one spot. You're like, something's gone wrong with the links. You look in all the A tags, look in all the classes that you're using on your A tags, look in all the IDs that you're using on your A tags, and really look in there. And that's a lot easier to troubleshoot, and it's a lot easier to at the very least get started troubleshooting than it is being like, great, everything's in line, but we also have maybe some style sheets involved, and then specificity starts coming in, and it's a big mess.
So
Specificity, I think I've mentioned more than I wanted to this episode, because I think it actually comes up not as often in practice, but when it comes up in practice, it's a real pain.
So I do have a little bit of a contrarian take on this on the inline styles, and it's only because of a specific little tool framework for CSS that we're not getting into in this episode. But overall, I do like inline styles, but like Matt said, you kind of have to pick one or the other. I don't think mixing the two is a good idea regardless of what you do. Because if you have one pattern of like inline styles, and the tool that I'm talking about is Tailwind CSS, once you get into the more like trendy topics of CSS, you'll probably run into it. It's something that makes it easier for you to write inline styles and makes it more repeatable, easier to manage and stuff like that. And I personally have used it over the past 2 to 3 years, and I really enjoy it, but I don't use it like inline. I don't use style sheets alongside it as well. I am very much one or the other, because then I know how it's going to go. I can look at an element and I know exactly what styles are affecting it. I don't have to pretend that there's another style sheet somewhere that I need to go to check that. So there's two places to check. I don't like that.
Yeah, like it. I mean, I think that you mentioned a good thing, is that this HTML and CSS now crash course is definitely for like the 3 pillars when you're using those. And
Yep.
it applies in other instances as well. But as you go into different systems, like Mike's using Tailwind and things, as you go into different systems, the actual situation that those systems give you is like around an idea of engineering. Like they've engineered things to be a certain way. So if you're using that tool, you're supposed to do things their way. So you definitely have to be a bit malleable with your own, say, rule set. Where if you're like, I'm never using inline styles, and then something comes along that's like, this is really easy to use, and a lot of people really like to use it, but it requires inline styles. It's like, okay, like maybe I'll loosen up a little bit here. I actually have a question, Mike. So I haven't used Tailwind CSS in probably a couple of years now. You're not, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not setting the style attribute, you're setting the class attribute to a bunch of style names, right?
Yeah, very true, very true. It just looks kinda like you're setting a style
Well,
because
and it's
the attribute names are kind of very directly correlated to a CSS style, right? So, like, flex like, as setting flexbox, you would just put flex in there, setting justify item center, you would put justify item center. Like, it almost looks like you're writing CSS in line in the class tag. So it's a little
right.
bit different, you're right, but it's kind of the same.
Yeah, yeah. So inside your class attribute, you'd literally put like flex
Yes,
space text dash center space things like that.
exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the same as when I was around. I was gonna say maybe there's been a big change because I haven't used it in a little bit. Number 4 here, not using reset or normalized CSS. So different browsers, this is something that is going to stump beginners. Different browsers have default styling that can cause inconsistencies if not handled. So if you're using maybe Chrome, if you're using Edge, you're using Safari, let's just use the body tag as an example. Maybe they'll set the margin of the body tag. Well, one might set it to 2 pixels, one might set it to 5, one might set it to 3. And so when people say reset or normalize, what they're talking about is you kind of find out, okay, all these browsers are messing with the body tag, they're messing with the margin property. I'm going to zero that out at the very, very top of my CSS style sheet, and then I set it afterwards. That's what resetting is. This is absolutely something that happens, especially with, I would call them, more complex HTML elements, such as lists, where the different browsers will mess around with the padding and the margin and all that thing for lists because the browser, wants to be able to display those elements like for example an unordered list and all its list items in a specific way. Because if you're just doing CSS, having a little bit of styling allows you to at least read that CSS is the kind of important thing. And so, or sorry, if you're just doing HTML, sorry, if you're just doing HTML and you're not doing any CSS, the browser still wants you to be able to read all the structure and the basic content that you've put on. And so the browser will do a little bit of styling for you just so you can generally read your HTML. A very common one that I haven't done this in a while actually, but for headings, like if you look at headings like H1 through H6, I always just hard set my headings. But hey, headings is a great example where if you do H1, H2, H3, H4, and just do that down the page on your HTML, you'll notice that the H1 is the largest and the H6 is the smallest font size. And that's set by the browser. So could effectively just zero that out, or I just actually set it to whatever I want, and then I don't really have to worry about it. But that's just that general idea of like, hey, the browser is going to mess with your stuff, so you may need to zero out or reset some of that stuff. Forgetting about responsive design. Now, this is something you may not do, step one, but I think that you should learn this rather early, and that is that we no longer have, sites and then mobile sites. It's something that many of you may not even realize, but many websites used to have a different website for mobile versus non-mobile, and we don't do that anymore, right? Our content boxes, our page bodies, our whatever stretch and change different sizes and display things in different orders and hide things and show things in different ways depending on the screen shrinking or growing or the window size shrinking or growing. And this is something that is going to take you a long time to learn. It's going to take you quite a bit of practice, but setting things in fixed widths, for example, you have a content box and you're like, I'm going to set the width to 1,000 because it looks great on my computer. Well, fantastic. But how's that going to look on an iPhone? You're going to have to scroll left and right. Like that's not going to look good. We're talking maybe not going to be the greatest for mobile users. This is something that goes a little beyond the scope of a crash course, but just keep in mind that you could use things like relative units where you can do like, hey, I'm going to do 50%. And so my content box is 50% of the width of the window, for example, or of the browser or of the area that I've set. And so now when the screen shrinks, it won't pour off the screen. It'll just be 50% of the width. That's a very, very easy, very, very high level example because there's tons of stuff you could do for responsive design. And maybe, yeah, maybe that's even a topic for another day. But just as you start to learn responsive design, or I like keep it into consideration. I'll say this: generally understand HTML and CSS. So let's say you understand your HTML now, you're good. You're just starting CSS, so you're just starting to get the the hang of it and how you select things and how you do things. I would start learning responsive design rather early, just so that you generally understand how to do it. A lot of it's just setting things instead of like hard pixels to like, oh, I want this to be the full width of the screen. How do I do that? Oh, I want this to be half of the width on mobile. How do I do that? It's not a lot more difficult. You just have to be really considerate of different screen sizes and different design. And you just have to know the different units, like percentages, rem, a whole bunch of other things as well. So just something to consider there. But again, beyond this crash course here. This is another one that's going to trip beginners up. Confusing position values, and I did this a million times. So, position is something where you choose the position of whatever it is you've selected, absolute, relative, and fixed. These things will absolutely trip you up. I'm not going to explain this in an audio show because I don't think I really can too well. I'm just going to say that make sure you read up on the various ways to set, interact with, and how to properly use the position values, because I've seen people absolutely, literally, like position absolute, position everything on a web page. That's a total disaster. And I want to be clear, that is a total disaster. I've fixed websites that have done it. It's an absolute nightmare. Don't do that. So please understand the difference and the use cases for absolute, relative, and fixed. Just please
I'll
do
say
that.
one thing about the absolute relative, especially the amount of times I've screwed up by not putting relative on the parent container of an absolute is too many to count. So Matt is 100% right. Learn how to use absolute properly because there's a way to do it and it's much easier, but just putting absolute on everything without any relative containers, I'm going to tell you that's not the way to go.
And relative sounds confusing as well. I'll say this because relative sounds like you're like, well, like all like most CSS properties only affect this element. Why do I care if the thing inside's absolute and the thing around it is relative? I'm not even going to tell you. Go look that up and
Yeah,
get it to
just
proper tutorial because I've messed that up a million times as well, especially in the beginning.
Mhm.
Go check that out and see what I mean, because otherwise it's going to be a disaster. Like don't absolutely position your entire layout because I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to help you fix it. I've been there. I've already done that. Number 7 here, getting close to the end, not testing across browsers and devices. So there's definitely a lot of samey CSS, and I mean a lot, like probably like 90 to 99% realistically, that your site will look great on everything. Make sure you test it though. Test it on Chrome, test it on Edge, test it on Firefox, test it on Safari, and also I'm going to say this, test it on mobile, please. Test it on, whatever you're targeting. If you're targeting, the people at large, test it on all the major browsers and test it on mobile as much as you can. I know it's easier said than done if you don't have an iPhone, you don't have Safari mobile. I get it. Please test them wherever you can because sometimes you're like, yeah, this looks great, but then this browser interprets this position or this margin differently, and your title might be way off onto the right when it's supposed to be way off onto the left, and maybe there's already something on the right. Now it looks friggin' ridiculous. So just make sure you test. Most of the time it's fine, but just do it because it won't always be, especially with complex layouts. And absolute last one, too much reliance on copy paste. This is more of a human problem than it is a technical issue. Beginners often grab snippets without understanding them, leading to messy code later. This is absolutely true in the age of ChatGPT, and it was absolutely true in the age of Stack Overflow, which is where I kind of came up and learned this stuff. People are just grabbing CSS, not understanding what it means, throwing it in there, grab some other CSS, put it in there. Think about all the things we just discussed: specificity, cascading. You're putting a bunch of stuff in there that's all cascading and has different specificity ratings, and you're maybe putting it in different spots, like inside of your style attribute, inside of an internal style sheet, inside of an external style sheet. You're putting it all over the place. Everything's cascading and choosing specificity scores, and you don't know what everything does or how everything works or why some of the stuff is there. think about the disaster you may be walking into, and it is a disaster. So my recommendation with CSS is, especially with properties and like setting up basic elements, like commonly made elements like nav bars and content boxes and things, understand as much as you can. And I understand copying and pasting things to see if things work. I do that too. Don't overdo it. Because I'll tell you right now, it's not going to make it maintainable, and you're going to have the same issue as you did overusing IDs. You're going to have like selectors that are too specific. You're going to have hard to maintain code. Things are going to be difficult. You're going to be running around trying to find out whether important was set and this and that. And actually, that is it. This is a prime example of what Mike and I were just saying, where you have like a CMS and all these theme files and all these things that like maybe a website was built in some sort of website builder, and then you go to write your own CSS and you can't get it to work. Think about all the mess, that abstraction of the website builder. So then we just put important in there. Well, imagine if you are copying clips and they're not working, so then you just start adding important in there to make them work. Now, what if something else needs to be overwritten in that same on that same element or in that same sort of general style situation, and you're copying snippets and you still don't know what's going on? You can see where this is going. So please understand what you're doing in CSS as much as possible. It's not going to be perfect, but please do, because let me tell you, it ain't fun to troubleshoot CSS for a long time. It ain't fun
Mhm.
at all.
Yeah. The other thing that I will recommend as well is learn the Chrome DevTools or the Firefox DevTools, doesn't really matter. That's gonna make troubleshooting CSS a lot easier.
Oh, I use it all
You
the
can
time,
yeah,
100%.
yeah, use it all the time. It's constantly up when I'm doing any CSS, looking at what elements are being affected by what CSS. That's how I get to that really, really quickly now. They've gotten so much better. They have like grid layout selector stuff in there that's super, super cool. They have for padding and for margin, especially, I use it a ton because they have like calculations, how it's calculated. Everything is in there. Highly, highly recommend spending some time learning the Chrome DevTools when you're doing CSS. It's gonna make your life a ton easier.
I almost feel like we should actually do an episode on that, actually.
Chrome DevTools, absolutely, or
Cr-
DevTools in
Just
general.
Dev tools in general, because like
Yeah.
honestly, like I use them a lot myself, and like you can use it for network and performance and
Mhm.
everything else, and like CSS is huge, and I feel like it might translate a little difficult to audio, maybe I don't know, but I feel like that's absolutely something we should touch on, because
We
people
might have had an
here.
episode on it.
Yeah, well, that does sound kind of familiar. I mean, we've had a lot of episodes now. If there is an episode, we will include it in the links. I'm not sure if you have it there, Mike, but
I'm trying to find it. I don't think we labeled it as Chrome DevTools. I think it was maybe part of an episode. So, yeah, I think you're right. It's probably time to redo it anyway because a lot of things have changed. So, yeah, look for that in the future.
absolutely, yeah. I think that's going to be a cool thing to discuss. Maybe even a crash course if these crash courses
Mhm.
do well. And yeah, just final thing, no more technical stuff. Just if you like this episode or you found it helpful, please let us know that, because I'm trying something new here. If you want more syntax, less syntax, there was barely any in this episode. If you want more information, less information, please let us know. I'm taking feedback. You can comment on Spotify. You can reach out on any of our socials as well. It'd be great to hear from you, because I want to know if people like this. Pretty much. But that's it. Remember that we are on Patreon if you're interested in supporting the show. Patreon.com/HTML, all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website Swoon worthydesigns.com. And just a reminder that we are powered by Code Rabbit. They give you the power of AI code reviews to help cut your code review time in half. Check out the link in the show notes and episode description to net yourself a 14-day free trial, no credit card needed, and just a 2-click sign up with a GitHub or GitLab account. And if you want to help yourself and us as well, you can do so and net yourself up to 20% off a Scrimba Pro plan. You can find that link in the show description and show notes. They are a course offering place. They have an interactive media player code editor where you can pause what the instructor is doing, interact with the code live, go ahead and break that CSS live as the instructor is explaining it. There's a variety of instructors, there's a variety of courses. Go and check that out. And they do full stack now. That link is on in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com, and it's also in the episode description in your podcast app if it supports links. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on htmlallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.